everybody, and welcome to another one in our incredibly long-running series of financial wellbeing podcasts. I've got a bit of a cold, so I will apologise in advance if I sound a little bit throaty. However, I'm still keen to get going. My name's David Lloyd, by the way. I'm a broadcaster, I'm a writer. I'm kind of retired now. I don't do so many of these things that I used to do. However, one of the things I do is get together every so often with a couple of mates and talk about money. And let me introduce those mates to you now. Chris Budd, who are you?
Hello, David. Who am I? I am a new trustee of St. Peter's Hospice, which is fun. I've got a few things going on, actually, that's starting to happen. But I'm also the writer of the original financial wellbeing book back in 2015. I wrote that now, which seems an awfully long time ago.
Congratulations about the hospice trusteeship, then. Tell us a little bit more about that, if you would.
Well, somebody got in touch and asked me if I'd be interested. I do various non-exec and trustee things, and I do have a bit of space. One of my friends, somebody you know as well, David, he just told me a long time ago that he wanted to spend his working life 3 days a week in work, 1 day a week community, and 1 day a week charity. And I thought that was a really nice way of apportioning one's time. So, I had a space for a trustee role. And, I haven't started yet. I haven't had my first meeting, but obviously trustee hospices are charities and need an awful lot of volunteers and support. So, it'll be a very interesting little thing to get involved in.
And I think you are the ideal person, if I may say so, Chris, to be doing that sort of a role. So congratulations.
Lovely man you are.
Well, I do my best. Talking of lovely men, we've got Tom Morris in the room with us as well.
I have no new roles. So it's the same old. I'm a director and chartered financial planner over at Ovation Finance in Bristol, who, as you should all know by now, support this podcast. So there you go. Not really much more to add than that this time, David, I'm afraid. Yeah, I know.
I prefer to choose the word reliable.
Yes, reliable. I like that.
I mean, you and I can be a little bit mercurial sometimes, Chris. I might even say away with the fairies on occasion, whereas Tom is reliable, solid, wise. He is he's the bedrock of everything that we do. And if it wasn't for people like Tom, this podcast would, quite frankly, be a mess. And also, of course, producer Tammy, who's there in the background as well. Without her, the whole thing would be non-existent. Anyway, I'm getting boring now, so let's move on. What's on today's podcast, Chris?
Today, David, we are going to be looking at Maslow's hierarchy of needs.
It's an old psychological model, I think you'd call it, for why we do things and in what order we do them. Pretty well known, I think. But I thought we'd have a look at it in the relationship to money and see whether money helps or hinders how we go about satisfying those needs.
Sounds fascinating stuff, Chris. But before we move on to the main event, we ought to go for the thing that we always do. Actually, you could call this the main event. It's the Tightasstommo tip. We have our champion of cheapness, Tom Morris here, who every episode comes in with a money-saving tip, telling us how we can save money on some things. Before we do that, Chris, have you got anything to contribute to this particular section this week?
Yeah, I do actually. We're having a bit of work on the house, and I asked the guys doing the work what they were like with money. To have a little chat with them about money, and they were very, very funny, I have to say. Turns out, Tomo, I think your crown is in danger of being stolen because one of them is the most tight-ass person I've ever heard in my life. And I've got two tips from him. He got rid of his dishwasher and washes up stuff by hand because he thought that would be cheaper. I've got no idea. He has no evidence whether that's right or not. But he doesn't fill up a bowl of washing up liquid. Oh, no. He does 1 cup at a time. And he will fill up 1 cup with hot water with a little dab of washing up liquid, wash that up, pour that up into the second cup, then pour that into the cereal bowl. So he only uses 1 cup of water to do his entire breakfast washing up. How about that for tight?
Does he live on his own?
No, he's married. He also told me with a huge pride, I can't tell you the swelling of his chest when he told me that he fixed his energy price last month just before the price went up. And as a result, he saved himself £1 per month.
Good for him. Well, it's good to know that tightassery is in existence throughout the country, all started by Tom. I've got one actually this week, kind of slightly more boring, and it's a bit of an obvious one, and a lot of people will go, well, hang on a minute, didn't you know this? And of course I didn't know it, but I didn't do anything about it. So as I alluded to in the introduction to this podcast, I've kind of recently retired, not necessarily out of choice, but just because the program Doctors that I used to write for has been cancelled by the BBC. And I do little bits of work here and there. I do a little bit of teaching. But I'm going to be 70 next year, and I've started to reassess my life and thought, hang on a minute, do I really need to be out there chasing more work? No, I don't. I think it's probably time to just, unwind a little bit. And indeed, Tom, as my excellent financial advisor, and I have been having conversations around this and how to prepare for the next stage. But one of the things that my partner and I looked at was our monthly expenditure and thought, well, okay, now I don't have the big checks coming in that were coming in before. We are financially comfortably off, but we started to look at how we could maybe just economize a little bit. And I've realized that by shopping in a slightly different way, I can save myself hundreds of pounds a month by not going to Waitrose, which is a starter, which is our local supermarket where we always used to go. Great supermarket, fantastic choice, but it's not the cheapest. And by not going to the shops every other day, which is what I tended to do, so now I do a weekly shop at Lidl. Other cheaper supermarkets are available. And all of the stuff that I would routinely buy at Waitrose, like soap powder and everything and things like that, you will get because you're doing your weekly shop there, I've realised is half the price. And so now by shopping once a week and planning the budget a little bit more, planning our meals a little bit more, because I do most of the cooking, I am saving, I reckon, between £400 and £500 a month on our food and drink bill. Which has been a real I've only been doing it for a month, but it's been a real eye-opener, realizing that these low-cost supermarkets do sell decent quality stuff that is a hell of a lot cheaper than the more top-end ones.
Wow,
So
that is amazing. David, that actually fits in with something that I just wanted to touch on in this section, which isn't Tightasstommo, but it is in this kind of area, which is that students are going to university either back or for the first time at the moment. And I know my son won't listen to this podcast, so I can get away with it. But he was given some money by his grandmother when he went off to leave home first time, and he spent it all on Deliveroo in the first 2 weeks. So some of the things that we might take for granted, actually, stuff like some basic budgeting tips are really, really important. So I'm not sure too many 18, 19-year-olds will be listening to this podcast, but lots of parents of those would. And it is worth just sitting down with your kids and just giving a few basic tips that we might take for granted of how to save and how to make your money go a little further.
And you're never too old to learn these new tips as well. And it's interesting that, we could afford to carry on going to Waitrose, but actually if I'm saving that amount of money every month, then I can start to put that money towards holidays and more fun things. And, so anyway, we've all had a little Tightasstommo tip, but now let's go to the main man himself. What have you got for us, Tom?
It's food related, actually, and it's related to a supermarket, a different one. So we just had the summer holidays, and I had we just at the end of the summer holidays, and my wife had gone back. It was an inset day at school. She's a teacher. She'd gone back for the day to work, so I had the children on my own for the day. And the first bit didn't save any money because I promised them that we could go and buy some toys at the toy shop, as because they've been very well behaved for the last week or so, and they've been excellent children in the summer and all of that. So we went out to the toy shop. I thought, I got to save some money somewhere else then, haven't I? I'm about to buy this. So just opposite the toy shop was Morrison's. And parents or grandparents or anyone's got children with them, if you eat in their cafe and you spend at least £5 on their menu, the children eat for free. It was remarkable value. So I had a lovely lunch, a cup of coffee, and they ate for free. So all the family, less than a tenner in the end, it cost us to eat.
Right. Is there any age limit on children?
Wow, I don't know. I mean, it's the children's menu, so as long as the person you're bringing can deal with you know,
Chicken nuggets and
one of those,
chips.
you know, like or a squeezy yogurt for their pudding.
It's my son's 36th birthday coming up. I'm going to take him to Morrison's as a treat.
There you go, look. There you go. But also, if you Googled meal deals during the school holidays, it's amazing how many restaurants actually do a lot of cheaper children's meals during the holidays, and it's great because I think a lot of places recognise the costs of summer holidays.
Fantastic tip for the summer holidays that have just finished, Tomo. Brilliant.
All right, true. That is true.
By the time this goes out, it might be half term, so you never know. Right, okay, fascinating stuff. So let's move on to the main part of our podcast then. Tell us about Maslow's hierarchy of needs, Chris. As I said the introduction, I've heard of this, but I think we could probably do with a reminder about what it's all about.
Yeah, okay. So look, back in 1954, so this has been around quite a long time, a psychologist called Abraham Maslow suggested that human needs can be placed in a certain order. The idea is that we are motivated to fulfill one type of need, such as food, and until we have fulfilled that type of need, we'll struggle to go on to the next one. Hence the phrase, the hierarchy of need, the order of needs. And I thought it would be interesting to review the hierarchy and then add money into the mix. And we'll see whether it can help or whether sometimes it might actually get in the way of moving up that hierarchy.
This is actually a very real issue I see with clients all the time. You know, if someone is spending their money satisfying one need before they've already satisfied a more basic need, then this may well be making them unhappy.
Oh, now that's interesting. Let's hear about these different needs, and then perhaps we can come back to that, Tomo. That's quite fascinating. So, Chris, I would imagine that we're going to start off with things that we need for survival, such as food, drink, shelter, and so forth.
Yeah, exactly. Maslow called these our basic or physiological needs. It seems logical that if you don't have air to breathe or food to eat, then nothing else is really going to matter that much until you get them. Once we have these, then the second thing up the hierarchy that we think about is our safety or security. So that could mean, for example, finding shelter, but it can also refer to having some sort of order, having some sort of control over our lives.
So we're saying that if you were going to prioritize your actions at the most basic level, then you're going to make sure that you have food before a roof over your head. Yeah, that makes sense.
Then once you've got food and the roof, then the third comes love and belonging. So we're talking about friendship, trust, receiving and giving of affection.
Now, you've often said, Chris, in this podcast that the quality of our social relationships is a key foundation of our happiness. And yet, Mr. Maslow is saying that that's third in his criteria of needs.
Yeah, so look, in 1954 he first came up with this. And it's important, I think, to clarify that Maslow didn't suggest that this was a especially strict hierarchy. It's not like, I know, video game where you've got to complete one level before you can get to the next. So people will sometimes stay in an abusive relationship because their need for love is stronger than their need for personal security. So it's about priorities and about where we focus our attention. It's a model that we can use.
I can certainly imagine that somebody who doesn't have food or shelter is going to try and get them before they start worrying too much about their social relationships.
Okay, so let's not get too distracted about the exceptions, but just acknowledge that there are some and that this is about priorities. So we've had food, water, shelter, love and belonging. What's the fourth tier, Chris?
So the fourth tier, once we get through those first three, is self-esteem. This could include ideas of self-worth, of accomplishment, of having respect and giving respect.
You described the first two basic needs as being physiological. Love and self-esteem feel like that they're more psychological?
Yeah, exactly. That's what Maslow called them. So we go from our physiological or basic needs and then to the psychological needs. The final of the 5 tiers that we then reach after self-esteem is what Maslow called self-actualization. And in this area, we've got things like creativity and achieving one's full potential.
Well, that sounds ambitious.
Yeah, and look, one would argue that you should never achieve your full potential. because then you find out how exactly how limited it might be. So Maslow, he didn't think that everybody would even reach that stage, particularly not permanently. But you might achieve that level at certain moments, such as a sporting triumph or a particular achievement.
Well, I love my sport, so this gets me thinking. And I wonder, this self-actualization level suggests that if somebody wants to achieve something, then they should prepare for it by making sure that they have food, security, love, and self-esteem first. Is that a fair comment?
Makes absolute sense. I think if you're training to be in the Olympics and you're not looking after your body with food well, then you're going to struggle to perform. Listeners might want to go back to the interview with Olympic diver Leon Taylor in episode 99, who talked about how his performance improved once he started caring for himself and took time to relocate the joy in what he was doing. One of my favourite episodes that we've had.
Yeah, I do remember that now you come to mention it. But before we look at how money might help us move up this hierarchy of needs, I've got a few questions. Now, I know you said we mustn't be too dogmatic about how we applied it, but it does seem that there are some flaws. For example, surely somebody can fall in love whilst being hungry.
And look, if you look online at Maslow, then you do see a lot of people criticising the model for that sort of thing. And to be fair, Maslow did say that you have to complete one level before the other when he first published it. But that was in 1954, and he continued to refine it over the years many, many times. And as late as 1987, he said that the hierarchy is not nearly as linear as he may have earlier implied. But I don't think that makes it unuseful. I think the principle is still a really, really good one. So it doesn't need to follow a strict progression, and you can feel various needs at the same time, like the example you've given. A creative person might focus mainly on the top tier, self-actualization, to the detriment of not having food. So you think of somebody like Van Gogh, or maybe, some of the tortured soul. So, but actually those exceptions tell us more about the human nature and makes the model even more useful and relevant, I think.
Yeah, I'd agree. One of the things I do like about this model is that it takes a very positive approach to human behavior. So often we focus on what goes wrong, for example, all the behavioral biases that we talked about in this podcast so often. And they are really important, of course, but as well as knowing that, what not to do, it's also really helpful to know what we should do. And I think this hierarchy gets us to think that way. For example, we might think, have I got something in place so that a certain level is in good shape, which will then allow me to think more about the next level up. I find this really helpful for both myself, but also when talking with clients when they're thinking about their futures.
Okay, so let's put money into the equation then. How do you want to approach this? Is it how money affects each of these 5 levels, or whether it helps us to feel secure at one level, move on to the next one, or maybe actually prevents us from getting past any particular level?
I think all of the above may well be true. Let's have a look at some of the theories about the relationship between money and happiness that we've looked at over the years. Let's slot them into Maslow's model and see if there's anything we can learn.
Yeah. I think the first two, the basic needs, are going to be fairly easy to plan around. Clearly, if we don't have the basic necessities of life, such as food and shelter, any money we have is going to be focused on getting that. And if I may just think about when I'm doing retirement planning in particular with clients, it's great if we can secure a lot of that basic need. Some people here might be familiar with the idea of guaranteed pension income, thinking like state pension, maybe annuities, or a final salary pension you've got through work. It's really nice if we got some of that in the mix. That means our basic Maslow's needs are met, so that if anything goes wrong, we've got those things absolutely solid in the plan.
Yeah, I do a lot of talks at conferences, and I do workshops or webinars on well-being, and quite often, and I would be talking about the importance of meaning and purpose and social relationships. And at some point, somebody very often puts their hand up and says, "Look, it's all very well for you to say this stuff about you're dealing with people with lots of money. What about people with no money?" And this is a very valid question, and this is the answer. Yeah, absolutely. You've got to secure those first two first. So. I realise that it can be a bit patronising sometimes how we come across. So there will be times when someone is struggling, but a bit more money would simply make their lives easier.
Can I just jump in here? I just want to make a point that financial well-being is often only focused on these two levels.
Yeah, very good point.
And we're talking about financial resilience, arguably here. So a lot of the next levels is actually the wider subject of financial well-being, not just these first two levels, although very important, as you mentioned, Chris. When you're seeing financial well-being talked about, are they just focusing on those first two levels? Anyway, sorry, I had a bit of a bee in my bonnet.
No, don't apologise. I think that's a very good point. And I think I might be able to add to that. I was reading something the other day about an experiment in Kenya, which looked at the impact of money on poor people. Now, I made a note. It was a website called Give Directly, and 200 villages were given some income that would enable them to cover these first two steps of Maslow's hierarchy so that they knew that they had food and shelter secured. Now, rather than making the villagers lazy, as some thought it would, the villagers actually responded by working more, even becoming more entrepreneurial. Now, I know there's been lots of research on this universal income idea, and we've discussed this in the podcast in the past. But it does seem to me that if you literally have nothing, getting enough to achieve those two basic needs can be really tough. But if society ensures that everybody has food and shelter, then surely moving on to the next stages becomes that much easier.
Yeah, it's a really interesting topic, David, and one that can rather divide opinion. There are those that say that we shouldn't provide any support at one extreme, because if you have nothing, then it's going to make you go out and get something, and it engenders a work ethic in the poor. And then there's others who believe we should help those who need it, give a leg up so they can start being productive for themselves and for society.
Well, I know which side I'm on.
Seconded.
So what I like about the research you mentioned, David, is that it sidesteps politics and uses psychological models such as Maslow's to explain why some support for those who need it actually can be a good thing for everyone.
Yeah, this is the whole culture wars thing, isn't it? I mean, some things are made political when they really shouldn't be political at all. We're just looking at basic needs for people. So let's move on to the first psychological levels, love and belonging.
So we've got lots of research to back this one up. Let's take, for example, the Harvard longitudinal study on happiness, where you may remember they've been following the lives of thousands of people over, I think, probably 80 years now, asking them on a 2-year basis, I think it is, about their lives, what's making them happy or unhappy. And if you remember, what they found was that people who reported the greatest levels of well-being were those that had the strongest quality of their social relationships.
And did money make a difference?
Not really, not to that. When first asked, people had predicted that money and fame would be the biggest determinants of their well-being, but the wealthiest people didn't declare themselves any happier than the poorest people, and the famous people were no happier than the rest of us.
Well, you and me, Chris. David's actually quite famous.
Oh yeah, good point.
Well,
Sorry.
actually, I dispute that. I was very nearly almost famous in 1992. But I think, I mean, what is fame? I don't know.
And that was, we should just mention what that was, that fame. That was Maid Marian and Her Merry Men, the TV show, was it not?
Indeed it was, yes. And and so for a while, that was a much loved and well watched TV program that I was one of the main characters in. And it was great time in my life. In fact, one of my claims to fame now is that I've appeared as an answer on Pointless. Contestants were asked to name somebody from Maid Marian and a Merry Men.
Oh, tell me you got some points.
No, I'm pointless. I was pointless. So that's how famous I am. So on one level, I'm absolutely chuffed that I've appeared as a pointless answer on Pointless. However, sadly, the answer showed how unfamous I actually am.
Well, I might take this opportunity as we're talking about Pointless to test if one of our friends, Chris, listens to this podcast. And talking about Rohan, who won Pointless with another person we know, Steve Nelson. They got their triple Pointless answer in the final. So Steve did. Rohan was just there for the ride, I think. So yeah. You've had the shout out, you got your trophy, Rohan. So this is the test of whether you actually thank me for the shout out to see if you listen to these podcasts.
Brilliant. Okay. Anyway, enough about my fame or lack of it. So what you're saying is that money makes no difference to finding love and belonging. So one needs some money to get through the previous two stages. So do we need money to get past this level?
I think money can make achieving this level easier. I know with clients that I work with, they are able to prioritize helping their loved ones. This could be able to afford a plane ticket to go travel and see their kids if they've moved abroad, for example, or to pay for a wedding, which brings families together. Or heck, even going out for a meal with them on a Sunday afternoon and being able to pay for it. Money can make a difference here. But what's important in this section, I think, is prioritizing. I've seen plenty of elderly people sitting on more money than they need and who are afraid to give some to the kids or grandkids, perhaps to help them buy their first home. A bit of a chat and some financial planning can make a big difference to those people. And a phrase I really enjoy is, this money is going to go to them eventually if they're hoarding it. Do you want to be given with a warm hand or a cold hand? So if you're this person, bear that in mind.
Whoa, brutal, but that's great.
Yeah, it's a very good analogy, that. But presumably this is only with people who haven't had financial advice before, because any financial advisor, such as yourself, Tom, and you've done it with me many times, and indeed you too, Chris, would have this conversation with a client who was like that, wouldn't they?
Actually, not necessarily, unfortunately. I actually refer to the last episode with Dr. Tom, and he talked about well-being maximizers and performance maximizers. If I just explain, you're familiar with cash flow forecasting, David, because we do it for you, and the conversations that we have to build that forecast. But for those listeners who aren't familiar with this phrase, this is where we use some software and our knowledge about areas such as tax and investments to forecast whether your assets and your financial plan is sufficient for the life you want to lead. Important there, the life you want to lead takes a lot of delving in and conversation. This includes whether giving some money away will cause a financial problem or not. Not all financial advisors use cash flow or even have those curious conversations, arguably. In fact, many don't use cash flow. They just advise their clients about their money, not their lives, that performance maximizer. So I don't want to denigrate our profession because there's amazing people in it. But if you are looking for these answers, make sure you're working one who's going to be curious about the life you want to lead and using cash flow.
I hear some financial planners say they don't use cash flow because their clients are already wealthy. They say their clients don't need it, which I really disagree with, because if you have a cash flow which shows that you've got enough, and maybe even there's an amount of money you won't ever need, then you can use that extra money to benefit others, either as Tomo described, by helping your loved ones, or it could be through philanthropy, for example.
Yeah, I always get that. That's a real mouthful, that word, Chris.
Through philanthropy. That makes it even worse.
Yeah.
And we haven't discussed philanthropy for a long time, Chris. Could we look at that again?
I'd mate on it like a car bonnet. Leave it with me.
Now, Chris, we've talked about this before. That's a meaningless phrase. I know it's one of your favourite ones. It's talking about pointless things. It's entirely pointless. Please don't ever say that again.
But I'm down with the youth, David.
Oh dear God, is this where I now step in, David? In other words,
if you're claiming to be youth still, I mean,
well that's true.
Relatively speaking, he is.
Yeah, I'm still the right side of 40, Chris, for a few years yet.
I actually looked that up the other day. Youth is up to 40. Middle age, David, you're not going to like this, is 40 to 65. Old is 65 and over.
Pardon? Right, let's move on. Level 4, self-worth, a subject we've covered often.
We have, and we know from various sources that there are two types of self-worth, internal and external. And
can you remind us what those sources are?
Well, they're a lot, is the answer. But here is a few. So there's a book, The Book of Joy. I know Chris's favourite, by the Dalai Lama and Archbishop Desmond Tutu. This is a very Buddhist type concept, but really, really helpful. We've also mentioned intrinsic and extrinsic motivations many times, which is a similar principle. That was covered in the interview with Tim Kasser in episode 46. And also the one on self-determination theory in episode 77. So there's some resources to get your teeth stuck into.
So let's apply them. Can money help us find internal self-worth? I think the answer is yes, but it does take real thought and planning. So, for example, we might want to look at how we allocate our time rather than our money. I mentioned earlier on about the friend who sold his business and then decided to spend his working week 1 day charity, 1 day community, 3 day business. So that is related to, and he can only do that because he sold his business and had financial security, but he then used that to allocate his time.
Yeah, I love that idea. I really like it. Allocation of time is something we often discuss with clients at Ovation. You do, however, need to have some money to have that flexibility.
Yeah, so money can certainly help. But I've also met plenty of wealthy people who have enough money, but who then focus on continuing to accumulate more wealth rather than reallocating their time.
Yeah. Which reminds me of the comment from, if you remember, Sonia Lyubomirsky, when we looked at set point theory. How can we change our long-term level of well-being? But it requires intentional activity to do that.
So money can help achieve self-worth, but only if we work at it. And as you say, though, it must also get in the way a lot of the time.
Yeah, and that's the external self-worth. So this is why we need to work at it. If somebody's self-worth is based on their net worth, then there's no end point. We end up in a cycle of having to constantly accrue more wealth in order to impress other people and thereby get our sense of external self-worth. If our happiness is always on the other side of somebody else's approval or admiration, then we can never really achieve happiness.
So I could see how it would be very easy to get trapped in level 4 if we just see money as an objective.
Yeah, absolutely. It's back to that question of whether more money will make us more happy. And the answer is yes, if you're somebody who needs more money to be happy. And if you are that person, your life will be focused on accumulating more money or more stuff in order to keep feeding that need.
Okay, well then let's now move on. Look at level 5, this self-actualization. Now, I'm not honestly sure I totally know what this means.
It is a bit nebulous. Fulfilling your potential is one phrase that Maslow used in whatever arena that might be. So for a creative person, David, like you, for example, it will be spending out your time being creative. You've had a long, and we think we've agreed, I'm going to use the word successful. I'm going to go out there. Successful career as an actor and writer. So I'd say you're a very good example of this.
Yep, I'll take successful. Famous, I'm less sure about. But yeah, I certainly, within the context of the industry in which I work, I have been quite successful, and I'm very grateful for the success that I've had. I'm also now, though, as I move into a different phase of my life, having to reassess what makes me tick, because that creativity, I'm not using it in the same way that I used to. And I'm about to start writing another novel, actually, because I've realized that without having that there, with somebody saying to me, you've got to go and write this thing now, which is what I've always had, when you've written that thing, we'll give you some money, which has always been a great motivation for me. I need to find an internal motivation for me to sit down and continue to be creative in a way that's always made me feel good about myself. So I'm just having to reassess how I approach that.
Yeah, you're spot on. I mean, this could be a big issue for people moving from one phase of their life to another. An obvious example, and you've given it, is retirement. But it could also be career change or career break. For example, starting a family. It's easy to get dragged into focusing on the money at this stage. For example, whether you have enough for retirement. But actually, we need to think about what we're going to be doing in retirement. But it's also important to consider this self-actualization point as well. Again, taking retirement as an example, you go from being someone with work colleagues and a meaningful job to being someone who is classed as retired. Having a period of adjustment can help, such as reducing hours, a bit of a phase into it, or leaving a job to do a part-time consultancy for a while. It could be helping a charity or mentoring, some way of phasing your way into retirement, preparing yourself for retirement. In this way means considering what you'll spend your time doing for well-being, and only then creating that cash flow forecasting I mentioned, that financial plan, to see if it's achievable. But we really have to think about how we're spending our time if we're going to transition to doing something else.
Another word Maslow used to try and get clarity on this self-actualization is he's talked about people feeling fulfilled. Again, we talked a lot on this podcast over the years about having meaning and purpose in life is one of the key sources to well-being, and these intrinsic motivations that we've mentioned. And this is not necessarily something that needs money. Getting involved in the community, for example, so that's helping at a local sports club, school governor, David, I know you're a parish councillor. These sorts of things don't need money. It could be feeling fulfilled creatively, which I found from writing novels, which you can do in your spare time. David, you and I are setting up a youth cricket section of our local club. A friend of ours, David, mine is a surgeon, and he makes amazing pots in his spare time. So there's lots of things that you can do that doesn't need money that will make you feel fulfilled. So I think possibly this is the one area that money is more likely to be a distraction rather than being something that will help you achieve it.
Yeah. I mean, so there's lots of ways of getting well-being once you've got to this level, but it firstly takes at least some attention to the previous levels, and not too much focus on accumulating money for its own sake. So there's a real balancing act going on here. In my experience, it also helps to have a third party. I would say this, to have a third party, such as your financial planner, challenging you in order to get this balance right. And creating, we talk about it, creating a clear path to identifiable objectives. One of the key 5 pillars of financial well-being.
And there we have it. I think that wraps it up quite nicely, actually. I found it a really fascinating conversation today, actually, talking about the various aspects of this and trying to pull it all together. And we've all got different life experiences that we've been able to bring to our understanding of this. And I'm sure people at home will be able to do the same as well. We do hope you've enjoyed that as much as we have, and that you'll join us again at some point in the indeterminate future for another one of our financial well-being podcasts.
If you want to be notified of upcoming podcasts, make sure you click the subscribe button. For more information on the topics discussed in today's podcast and to purchase a copy of the Financial Wellbeing book, please visit www.financialwell-being.co.uk. We'd love to hear your thoughts and ideas on financial well-being. You can send us an email at contact@financialwell-being.co.uk. You can follow us on Twitter @FinWellbeing. Chris is Ovation Chris, and David is @Dave_Backwell. This has been an Ovation Finance production. Thanks for listening to the Financial Wellbeing podcast. More interesting than you might think.